State leadership is also responding after some serious allegations made about lawmakers in the General Assembly. During a press availability today, Speaker of the House Matt Ritter was asked about lawmakers drinking during session.
To say that this is being taken seriously would be an understatement. I did read the blog, and it's fair to say that myself and Jason have admonished people. I think the incidents are a little more isolated, maybe not as widespread as some might think, but there's no question that we expect people to be adults, to understand the consequences of their decisions. And I have been very clear with people that if it happens again, there will be significant consequences associated with it.
Democratic leaders stress this issue, as you just heard, according to Matt Ritter, is not widespread. Speaker Ritter says that he has spoken with the appropriate people about the matter and says those who continue to break the rules will have to answer also to their constituents.